If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, have you ever encountered a cryptid, wendigo, or any woods creature, etc.? Tell us your stories. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but I saw something with at least a 6 wingspan and no feathers. Either a bat or a pterodon, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm leaning more towards the bat since it doesn't have a tail. There are very interesting creatures in this world. Hopefully evidence can be found in Indiana of what it is, because I'm still curious to this day. It scared the hell out of us, whatever it was, so I know I wasn't the only one to see it. One fall in the mid-90s, I stayed out later than I should have playing outside at a friend's house who had just gotten a new trampoline. We bounced for hours until the sun went down and then laid on the tramp, looking up at the night sky. There was a large tree in his backyard that was losing its leaves like all the others. Suddenly something slowly passed directly above us, maybe 10 feet above the top of the tree. I could barely make out its shape in the dark, but it seemed to be triangular, with a pointed tip and a definite wingspan between 7 and 10 feet. Most peculiar was the sound it made as it flew overhead, a whiffing sound like a glider cutting through the air. Since I could barely see it, the sound it made as it approached and departed confirmed that there was absolutely something that passed over us. There was no flapping sound, no loud engine or buzzing, and it was almost completely silent. If we weren't quietly lying on our backs, looking at it as it flew over, we never would have known it was there. It was too small, quiet, dark, and flying too low to be a plane, but too large to be a bird and too quiet to be a flock. The only thing I had to go on was that about a week later, a different friend was in the same general area and saw something he described as a man-bat. It terrified him, and he talked about it for years after. When I was 13, I was on an ATV with my 2 older sisters, one 15 and the other 18. We were going to my grandma's, which was less than 2 kilometers away from my parents' place. We were traveling through our fields, but on the way, I suggested we go around the fence so we didn't have to open the gates. It was pretty much the same path, just a bit off to the side. We had gates because this was our pasture for the cows. As we got to the middle of the field, we all noticed something sitting on top of the hill we were about to climb. On top of this hill, we had a somewhat big pile of rocks from working the fields a long time ago. We slowed to a crawl because it looked human. We thought maybe a calf fell and was stuck, or maybe it was my uncle who looked after the cattle. But this thing was sitting weird, basically like how Spider-Man perches over buildings, crouched down on top of a rock. As we were sitting there trying to figure out what we were seeing, this thing slowly stood up, and my heart sank. Its arms were long, grossly long. I screamed to stop and instantly jumped from the front of the car to the driver, replacing my sister. As we were switching, this thing started running at us, but it was running weird. Its arms were swaying back and forth like a normal runner, but because of how long the arms were, it looked weird. You would think it would run on the long arms, but it didn't. It was running fast. I turned around and shot straight through the field. My sisters were screaming. It was still coming, but I honestly could not look back at this thing. I just said, "Don't look at it." We rounded the corner, and that's the last time we saw it. After that corner, it's trails to my parents' house. As we got home, I crashed the TV into the deck, trying to get in as fast as we could. We were so scared that my parents actually believed us. They called all the family to warn if it was a trespasser. They said nobody had seen anything or anyone in the fields. Now I want to describe this thing. It was tall, skinny, and wore no clothes. Just a body is what we could see, a grayish color, and the head wasn't shaped like a human. It was thin and small. We were about 30 to 40 meters from this thing. It happened during the day too, in Alberta. I've had a couple encounters that have left me feeling crazy and super off. I live in central New York, which is where each of these happened. So several months ago, I'd say probably around February or March, I was at a park with one of my friends after dark. We had gone there frequently, and nothing had ever seemed weird. My friend was standing off to the side of a shed a few hundred feet away from me. I was sitting in my car. I had been zoned out, looking at stuff on my phone. He had been talking on the phone with someone. It wasn't until I heard this strange barking that it didn't sound human or animal, per se. I couldn't figure out which direction it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from every direction. I looked up and saw my friend quickly walking down the hill before coming to a dead stop, mid-step. When I looked around, I saw, out of my side mirror, something stand up from all fours from behind my car and sprint off, way too quickly, into the surrounding woods. My friend came running to my car, getting in and locking the doors before saying, "Did you see that thing? It wasn't human. It looked like it, but it was way too tall and skinny. It had run up behind your car, And then when it was going behind your car, it squatted down on all fours and then got up and ran off. The second encounter, this happened a few months later, right around the start of spring. I was with 3 of my friends and one of their dads. We were in the middle of the woods at one of their campgrounds. They had gone off for a walk, probably 20 to 30 minutes ago. I had stayed back to watch the fire. Suddenly, the world had gone almost silent. I almost felt like I wasn't even in our world anymore. It's hard to explain. I heard this woman screaming, "No! No! Help! Someone help me!" I had just sat there, staring at the direction that I thought the noise was coming from, which was deeper in the woods. At first, I thought maybe it was one of my friends yelling, but none of them sound like that. Something had also been off about this voice. After a few minutes, it trailed off and got quieter as the world returned to normal. My friends had returned after another 15 to 20 minutes from a different direction than when I heard the voice. So a few years ago, myself and my bandmates played a show in northeastern Kansas. We drove back to our homes in Kansas City and chose to take the back roads and state highways instead of traveling further south to the interstate highway. As we're driving in a relatively remote area of Kansas, along a cornfield that took up the entire left side of the highway for several miles, I was driving, my bassist was in the passenger seat, and our singer was in the back, distracted by his phone. As we're driving along, my bassist and I suddenly see something on the cornfield to our left, a huge figure, at least 7 to 8 feet tall, suddenly darting into the cornfield on our left just as my headlights revealed it. We saw a towering figure suddenly dart into the cornfield, turning as if it had just realized it had been noticed. The figure, as far as I remember, stood at least 7 to 8 feet tall, and from the brief glimpse we caught of it, it appeared to be covered in feathers, similar to an owl-like creature. I distinctly remember myself and my bassist exclaiming loudly to each other, "Did you just see that?" as we passed by. We didn't stop to investigate because 1, it was close to 1 in the morning and we wanted to get home, and 2, duck confronting that thing. I was 13 years old when I encountered this strange being. It was winter, and I was living in a small village in Germany. I was on my way back home from church around 2200 hours, so it was pretty dark. In a side street under a lighted street lamp stood this thing. It was completely black, had no face and no clothes, was very tall, like about 2 meters, and the creature's arms reached below its knees. It just stood there in silence, and as I saw it and realized that it couldn't be a human, I was frozen in fear and couldn't stop looking at it until it made a step in my direction. In this moment, I ran like hell to the house of my parents without turning around. It didn't get me or something, but I was in extreme fear. I never talked to anyone about this because I feared that people would laugh at me. But I saw it, and it still haunts my thoughts now and then. Fortunately, I never saw it again. In summary, the thing was completely black, it had no details. There was no face, no color, no nose shape, and no eyes. It had normal proportions, except for the knee-long arms. It was very thin and approximately 2 meters tall. It made no sound. About 2 years ago, I lived in an old house outside of city limits in western Alabama. Wild hogs are considered a nuisance in this part of the country and thus are year-round game. The land wasn't mine, but it was legal hunting ground, so my landlord gave me and my friends explicit permission to take care of any hogs we came across. So a lot of the time, I was posted up on my back porch with a cigar and a gun, either by myself or with company. This land wasn't very clear. In fact, we only had about 20 feet from the porch to the tree line, then it would go down a hill and the brush would get thicker. So our hunting was just being quiet and looking for the beady eyes of hogs in the foliage when we heard rustling. So, all that being said, one night during my porch sitting, I heard some rustling. I started scanning the woods for this hog and eventually did come across a set of white, beady eyes. They weren't a hog's eyes, though, because these were eye level with me. As my eyes continued to adjust, the rest of the creature started coming into view. It was tall, thin, and had long, spindly arms and legs. Its entire body was completely black. I couldn't make out any other facial features besides the eyes, but what I could make out was that this thing was actually a good way down the hill, so the fact that it was still at eye level with me meant it was likely around 10 feet tall. It started up the hill, moving towards me, and I had this feeling in my gut that .45 caliber bullets probably weren't going to do much here. So I slowly collected my things and headed back into the house. It didn't make any sound as it moved, other than the slight crunch of leaves. As it climbed the hill, it somewhat stopped at the tree line, then turned and walked along the edge of it. It bobbed and lurched a bit as it walked, kind of like how some large birds bob their heads as they move. That was the most terrified I had been in a long while. So a couple years ago, I was living in a shabby suburb in southern Louisiana. Plenty of weird stuff happened in this neighborhood. It was about 5:30 to 6 in the morning, and the sun had barely come up, just enough for me to see the silhouettes of the trees. I was standing at a bus stop situated on a crossroads, with huge pine trees on either side of the road in front of me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement up in the trees. When I looked over, at first I saw nothing, but then what I had previously assumed to be part of the tree trunk began to move. I watched as this silhouette started slowly spreading an absolutely massive pair of wings. Then it jumped from the tree, and as it swooped to the trees across the road, I saw its legs. I shit you not, it had human legs. I could easily make out the shape of my knees and feet. I've been able to rule out all of the possibilities I can think of. It definitely was not an egret, the legs were too thick, the torso was too large, and I didn't see a neck. It was also way too big to be an owl. I'm talking about the size of a man, or maybe even bigger. The closest known description I can come up with is the freakin' Mothman, except I didn't see any glowing red eyes. I've lived in the northern Midwest my whole life and have come to appreciate the local lore that comes with it. In my late teens, I worked at a camp for a few summers. Now, my job at camp was sort of a catch-all. Basically, if they needed a role filled, I was the one doing it. It kept me busy, and I had many long days. My cabin was right on the edge of the hospitable portion of the land. Miles of marshlands and forests sat behind my cabin. I had the cabin to myself. But the weird thing was that every night I would be smoking and walking the public road, and I would hear screaming in the woods. It sounded like a woman was being murdered. I brushed it off the first night. It could be a prank, a fox, or an owl. It's in the woods. But it kept happening every night, as soon as I stepped onto that road. I decided not to let it bother me. I had to be up early every day. There is no sense in chasing noise in the dark. Well, the end of summer came around. One goodbye tradition we kept up over the years was that on the final new moon of the camp season, the ranger would take the staff for a spirit walk. We all met at the only street light on the public road that night. The rules are simple. No flashlights. No jingling keys. No running. If you run, we might not find you. They were half to scare people, half true. The woods were thick, and the marshes were dangerous. Everything was going smoothly until we reached a river crossing. It takes you to a clearing. The moment we crossed the bridge, the woods went dead silent. You could hear yourself breathing. And then, just like every night before, a blood-curdling scream ripped across the clearing. One of the new staff members was about to take off before me, and another grabbed his arms. "That's the screaming I've been hearing," I told my boss. "That's the screaming I hear every night." The ranger shushed everyone. The scream came again, louder this time. The ranger whistled in the direction of the noise. It whistled back. Suddenly, the screaming surrounded us. Behind us, to the right, to the left, the group closed in, shoulder to shoulder, not daring to even breathe. The ranger, ever serious and calm, said barely over a whisper, "We're turning around. Take the bridge back to the trail. We're going the long way." So, in hurried steps, we made our way back to the streetlight that we met under without muttering a word. Once we were in the light again, I could tell that the ranger was actually shaken up. This is the same man who was charged by a cougar in the dark and brushed it off. "I need a cigarette," he says. I give him one. After a few drags, he muttered, "I don't want to scare anyone, but I know only one creature that can mimic human voices like that." "It's a wendigo," I said, not even thinking. I was in shock. All summer, I walked that road, and this thing was out there. Screaming. Trying to lure me in. That's when he said that, yes, he thought the same. He first thought it was one of the neighboring property owners looking for their dog, calling out for them, so he whistled. All spring, he found deer strewn around the property. Not unusual, being the woods and all. But there were so many, and they were so brutally taken down. He said these things looked like they had been hit by cars. In the middle of the woods. Absolutely mangled. More bizarrely, no other animals would touch them. No one said much after that. My boss got sage from her cabin and gave everyone who asked for one a blessing. We were shaken. After that, I changed cabins. And I'm a little sorry to say I never stepped foot back on that property. Call me superstitious or silly, but I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. I lived pretty far north in Canada, BC. I lived in a place called Prince Rupert for a few years. It had a small population of 5,000 and was very wooded, right by the ocean. I was DD for my friends a few years back, and we were driving along the highway around midnight. The part of the highway we were on was very wooded. Now I was sober since I was the driver. I noticed a figure off the side of the road. It kind of looked like a bear but was very large, even for a grizzly. As we approached, this creature stood on its hind legs and looked at us approaching. It ran a few steps along the side of the road, then went into the thick forest. My hair was standing on end, and I had goosebumps everywhere, absolutely shocked. Now my friends were not in a position to collaborate on what I saw, but I believe I saw Bigfoot. My wife and I decided to make the drive to Colorado Springs on the recommendation of a friend of mine. She'd never seen mountains before, so I figured the Rockies would be perfect. Anyway, once we got to the closed-off part of Pikes Peak, we parked our car, got out, and just kind of took in the view. I didn't think anybody else was up there with us, except the guy a little up the way sitting in his truck, making sure people didn't go any higher than they were supposed to. I wandered off and started looking around the rocks and what few trees were up at that elevation. I heard some snow crunching nearby and assumed it was another sightseer, so I moved towards the sound of the crunching snow but didn't see anybody. There are a few trees here and there, but they are easy to spot. I'd gone pretty far from my wife at this point and didn't want to stray too much farther, but I was honestly hoping to see a wolf or something. I found tracks in the snow, and they were pretty small. The snow was kind of deep, so I couldn't really tell what kind of animal made them, but it looked like it walked on all fours, so I was really hoping to see a wolf. I followed the tracks around a tree and kind of carefully peeked around it, but didn't see anything. The tracks stopped there, though. I didn't get right up on the tree because, if it was a wolf, I didn't want to get face to face with it. What I did eventually see was a pure white thing scurrying away from the exact location I was looking for. It was pure white. I'm not sure if it was invisible or just blended in perfectly with the snow. It moved on all fours, had a huge bulbous head, kind of like the way you think of the typical version of an alien, and it had a spindly body. Its arms and legs were super skinny, and its body wasn't a whole lot bigger. Its arms and legs themselves were really long. I'd say it was probably between 4 and 5 feet tall if it were standing upright. It was a bit hard to tell with it always on all fours and in the snow. It turned around and took a look at me and had really small, black eyes and no defining features. Its eyes were really far apart and almost on the side of its head. Its feet and hands were buried, but when it went to move, I saw what its hand looked like. It had fingers that were way too long. Like, not ET long, but wiry, spindly fingers. It looked at me for just a second and then leapt forward away from me, and as soon as it landed in the snow, it was invisible again, or I just couldn't see it. Then it hopped again and took off running. It ran away from me, scaled some rocks in the distance like it was nothing, and crawled along the cliffside. Whenever it was in the snow, it looked invisible. I'm not sure if that's because it was all white or because it was, like, actually turning invisible. Anyway, in a few seconds, it was gone. When I got back to my wife, she was waiting in the car and didn't believe a word of it and thought I was just trying to scare her. To this day, she doesn't believe me. And I don't know what it was. I've never heard of any cryptid or anything like it, and on the trek back down, I asked the lady at the gift shop if people ever reported seeing weird things, and she just mentioned Bigfoot. I was in Shenandoah at Strickler Knob about 8 months ago. I ended up camping out there, despite the 45 degrees weather at night. I arrived at the parking area around 7 a.m. and noticed there were no cars. I planned on spending the night and hiking back in the morning since it was quite a drive. After hiking the entire route and coming back halfway to set up camp, it was close to 3 p.m. I spent the rest of the afternoon and evening eating food, smoking, and enjoying the peaceful area. After I decided it was time to call it a night around 7 p.m. I put all the trash and remaining food items in a bag and hung it 20 feet on a branch about 150 feet away from my campsite. I was extremely tired, so after making sure I was safe from any predators, I went to grab some firewood and prepared to sleep. As I grabbed some dead wood from a huge fallen tree, I heard extremely intense rustling moving towards me for about 3 seconds that seemed to come from about 100 feet away. It stopped as soon as I stopped and faced the direction of the noise. Totally freaked out and about 50 feet from my tent, I slowly backed up while shining my flashlight on the area to hopefully expose the source of the noise. Nothing. I made it back to my tent, and it was quite dark by this time, and I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. It was now about 8 p.m. I felt extremely unsettled, so I stayed outside of my tent and continued to stoke the fire, which only provided about 5 feet of light in every direction. It almost made me feel like a target more than it made me feel safe. I finally felt comfortable after not rustling for about 20 minutes, so I headed into my tent for my much-needed sleep. Just as I could feel myself transitioning into a deep sleep, I began to hear multiple women wailing in an extremely evil chanting manner that sounded like it was around 200 yards away but was also very muffled and faint. As I reached my full level of awareness, it started to get louder. In a matter of 30 seconds, It sounded like it was less than 50 yards away. I felt a level of adrenaline that I've never felt before. It felt primal. My entire body tensed up like I was hit with a stun gun or an ice bath. About 3 seconds after the noise got to around 50 yards away, it totally stopped. I slowly crawled out of my tent and yelled, "Hey! Who the duck is that?" Complete silence consumed the entire 100-foot open area I was camped in. I turned on my massive flashlight and shined it everywhere. I could sense an eerie energy. Nothing. As I made one last round with my flashlight, I saw something that would change my view of monsters and the paranormal forever. I briefly saw a woman for about 0.25 seconds who was fleeing from the tree line facing away from me, making almost no noise. She was wearing a medium-length white dress with insane amounts of dirt all over it, and she was bald. She also had no shoes and was flailing her hands in the air while making no wailing noises anymore. She ran the way a child would if they were caught trying to sneak up on you. I couldn't even utter a sound. I began to fear for my life so badly that I began crying, and my face was stuck in a frowning position. I went into full panic and grabbed my pack, which was thankfully already set up for my 5 a.m. departure, left my tent, and began running. I started making my way towards the tree line that markers for the trail started at, and I could see a small light about 200 feet in front of me at the bottom of the hill. I began running with my 25-pound pack considering it was 10:45 p.m. and the terrain was rocky and covered with roots and fine slick dirt. I fell once, coming towards the bottom of the first large descent, and saw the same woman as my eyes fell towards the ground during my fall. Luckily, I only scraped my knee on some gravel since I stayed on the sides of the trail. I started moving slowly and was constantly looking around, gripping my Benchmade Adamas 375 knife tighter than ever. As I approached the last part of the trail, which was totally flat and more grassy, I hadn't seen anything for over 2 miles. Suddenly and violently, I began to hear rustling from every direction, roughly 100 yards away in front of me, and it was coming up fast. I began running at a full sprint for the last 0.2 miles of the trail, finally passing the trailhead and approaching the parking area. I made it back to my car, and as I turned around, I saw 3 of the same women I saw before, who all began crawling at full speed away from me and towards the trail, as I shined my headlamp on them. I cried for the first 20 minutes after driving at full speed away from the trail, just happy to still be alive and not fully grasping the entire situation. I made it back to Route 81 and could still feel the evil those human-like creatures emanated. I had an experience several years ago that still causes me some degree of dread. This was at my parents' old house in the Texas Hill Country during the summer. We had a few cats that lived at that house, and one of them was a calico who refused to stay inside most of the time. She would also take long walks with us. There is a creek on that property as well, and while usually we never had any issues while down there, this one time had proven to be quite strange. Topaz the cat was unwilling to cross in her usual spot, and it was eerily quiet. I noticed a little later that she was acting as if something was threatening her, so I looked up and saw. This thing had long arms, and it was tall, but I don't remember anything like talons or claws. I do remember antlers and matted fur, but nothing gaunt or skeletal. And very large, dark eyes, oriented forward like a predator would. The weirdest thing about the whole situation was just being entirely overcome with fear and dread, literally to the point of vomiting. I threw up and sprinted back up to the house with my cat and avoided the creek for ages, though weirdly, I felt quite certain that whatever that thing was, it couldn't cross running water. And after a month, it felt like it had gone, and it was safe to go over there again alone. The encounter I made in September 2012 in a French wood in the neighborhood of Beaugé en Anjou. I was 20, and I was in an old small truck with an older friend, 55 years old, who was the driver. I was sitting in the passenger seat on the right of the truck. The truck was very old, and I remember we couldn't go faster than 30 or 40 kilometers per hour. We were driving from Le Havre in Normandy, and we took only the very small road in order to stop anywhere we wanted to visit, an old church, an abandoned house, a German fortification, etc. We were expecting to arrive at our destination, a troglodyte house that belongs to friends of mine, around 3 a.m. in the morning. But we were late, and it was 3 a.m. when we entered a huge dark forest in the night. We were driving slowly in the woods on a small, straight road. The old lights on the truck were some kind of blinking yellow. At a point, I saw some very black humanoid outlines on the left side of the road. It was a very clear outline because it was in the light of our truck. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have seen it. The creature was on 2 legs as a biped. No tail. At first, I couldn't see any arms. As we were slowly approaching the creature, I saw it turning its head in our direction. We were silent in the truck, saying no words. My friend was just driving, and I was wondering if I was hallucinating. We slowly drove in its direction, and it straighted to cross the road as it was staring at us. It has big yellow eyes, like a howl. It was around 1 meter high. We were almost at its level, and I remember fearing that it would open my truck door and grab me. I was really in fear. I saw its arms swinging along its thin, black, hairy body. It has hair on all its body. I saw it at its outline as we approached it. It arrived on the other side of the road and suddenly stopped and turned in our direction, still staring at me, or us. A few seconds later, we passed it. And I didn't move my head, just looking at the right rearview mirror, seeing that it was staring at our truck, letting us drive away from him. My friend and I didn't say a word. And half an hour later, we drove out of the dark woods, and I said something like, "Well, weird things in the woods, right?" And my friend was suddenly extremely nervous, saying, "Yeah, did you see that? What the duck was that?" We talked about it, and he saw the same thing as me. He thought he was hallucinating because we were very tired. But no, we saw that thing in the wood. Today, he is in his 60s and I am in my 30s, and we are both still haunted by this thing. We talk about it every time we meet each other. I had gone down to visit my friend at his college in Virginia, US. We had hung out on campus until like 3 a.m. and decided to go on a walk. We walked along a path and wound up in some woods. My friend insisted that this was a shortcut back to campus. We entered the woods and walked for about half a mile, only with our phone flashlights. Just as we crested the hill, I saw something. Originally, I thought it was a white owl sitting on the trunk of a rotten tree. However, as we walked closer, my curiosity turned to horror, as it was clear it was not an owl. About 20 yards from us, a white face peeked around the tree. Its face looked like it was made out of old bone, slightly yellowed and cracked. Its shape was like a mix between a human's and an elk's or horse's. Its eyes were sunken and black, and it looked like it had charcoal dust rubbed around them. It had no mouth and no nose. I stopped and tried to get my friend to look. That's when it peered around the stump. Its long black arm pulled it around as if to get a better look at us. Its fingers were long and thin, like spider legs. It tilted its head and wrapped its other arm around the tree. I grabbed my friend's arm and sprinted in the other direction. I have searched online for weeks, looking for anything that describes the creature I saw. The only thing I can compare it to is the wendigo. Not me, but a very close friend who is still haunted by this over a decade later, and I know he believes it regardless of what he actually saw. We'll call him John because that's his name, and it would be hilarious if, by some insane coincidence, he read this. So John didn't get a car until much later in his teens. He used to do a lot of walking when he couldn't get one of us to give him a ride somewhere or convince us to pick him up. One time he was visiting a girl off the beaten path in our town, surrounded by heavy woods. He couldn't get a ride home, so he was in for a few-mile walk. He ended up trying to take a perceived shortcut, cutting through some woods he thought would bring him to a main strip not too far from his house, basically leading to the back of a mini mall. He was wrong and ended up going deep into the woods. He reached a strange clearing with a pond. None of us know it, no one else seems to know it, a mystery small pond out in some woods somewhere, which is possible because it would be a bitch to get to, no trails, no roads, just dense woods. If he didn't think he was going to end up in the back of a Kmart plaza a half hour later, he never would have gone that way either. So he's crossing this strange clearing, and as he gets to the tree line on the other side, he sees a small figure about 3 feet tall, about 20 feet to his left. This figure appears to be as surprised to see him as he is to see it. John is pissing his pants at this point because he claims this thing looks like some kind of troll, hairy, hunched. The troll stares at him for a second. John is about to turn around and run for his life from a 3-foot creature, but it says to him, "Pass." As far as he could tell, pass. He thinks it was telling him to pass, but noted its voice was not very human-like but more like what something like that would sound like in a movie, part animal, part human. He said it also gestured a bit with its arm, and he claims it had some kind of claw fingernails. He darted past, saying "I'm really sorry," and eventually, an hour later, hit some train tracks, which he was able to follow back home, or rather to a street he could then take home. I laughed hysterically as he frantically recounted this story to me, but within a minute I had stopped because I could tell he wasn't trying to mess with me. He really looked like a person who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. This is a story my father told me when I asked if he believed in ghosts or aliens. My father is a very logical, intelligent man who favors fact over speculation, and yet he still has no idea what he saw. I have done my best to try and find similar stories, descriptions, or anything else, but it seems to me that my father's story may be unique. Hopefully, someone will have some answers for me to give him. Some background: my father lived in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, in the 1960s. He was a child, 8 or 10, and had a younger sister, whom I will call Stacy. It was Stacy and my father's turn to do dishes. Their sink overlooked a modest suburban backyard with a 4-foot-tall white picket fence. Stacy suddenly stopped and was transfixed on something outside. She said my father's name and told him to look outside. He described it as an 8 to 10 feet tall humanoid. It was a rosy pink and see-through and had no describable details, as if it were wearing a big morph suit. And it was making the motion of walking but almost gliding or teleporting around the backyard, like clipping in a video game. Stacy became frightened and hid behind the counter. It was suddenly at the edge of the fence and bent over all the way. Its forehead would have been inches from the dirt in the neighbor's yard, hence the height estimation. My father blinked, and it was inches from his face on the other side of the glass. He said it had no features, and there were indents where facial features should have been. He was frozen with fear, and as quickly as it had come to his window, it was back by the fence. It then took an invisible staircase into nothing and vanished in thin air. My father said he has never seen it since, his sister never saw it again, and no one he has ever met has talked about anything like that. I've searched the internet, and skinwalkers are the closest thing, but I can't find anyone who is see-through. It's 3:43 a.m. in Tempe. My friend and I often like to explore parks late at night or early in the morning. Tonight, we went to Papago Park. From the moment we arrived, there was a car parked, but no one was in it. We thought maybe somebody was sleeping, but upon quickly glancing, we didn't see anybody, so we went to the park. From the moment we stepped out of the car, I saw a tall, lanky, humanoid-looking thing. I thought it was a person, but after blinking, it disappeared. My friend then saw the same figure, except black, a short distance from where I had spotted it. We figured our minds were just playing with us, so we went and decided to swing. The whole time, we heard rustling around us. She started to get nervous, so we started walking back to my car. I could see a small black figure pacing quickly, almost running back and forth between the trees. We were talking about it amongst ourselves when the car alarm went off. We booked it for my car and got in. As we drove away, there was still no sight of any actual person in the car or park. I went in the wrong direction when we started leaving, so I had to do a U-turn, and as I drove away, we could see the figure again pacing between trees. We were so freaked out that we stopped at a gas station, trying to figure out what it could have been. It's been about a year since my husband and I had an encounter with this tall, mysterious creature, but I haven't been able to let it go since it's been plaguing my dreams and keeping me from being outside at night. It was the middle of winter, and everything was powdered in white. Life had gotten quite slow, so my husband and I decided to take our 2 small children to his parents' house to enjoy a date night together. My in-laws only live 4 blocks away from us on the very bottom of a mountain in Utah County, so it wasn't a far drive. It was around 4 o'clock in the evening when we left our kids with my in-laws, and we had only planned to pick up some sushi and head back home. By the time we were done and back at my in-laws, it was around 5:45 in the evening. The sun was shining brightly but was about to make its way out for the night. We gathered up the kids, put their coats on, and headed out to the car. My father-in-law and 19-year-old brother-in-law walked out with us to say goodbye to the kids. As we were buckling them into their seats, we heard this horrendous noise. It sounded like a woman crying, a child laughing, and a bird cawing all at once. My father-in-law looked at me and said, "Are you hearing this?" My husband said, "Yes." "You heard that, too?" My brother-in-law mentioned he could hear it, too. I just stood there, silent, trying to dissect whatever this sound was and where it was coming from. And then I heard my father-in-law say, "Look on the mountain." He was pointing up about 100 yards away. I quickly grabbed the glasses from the top of my head for a better look, and there it was. Something big and black was hunched over a bush. We stared and listened to its cry in silence. "I'm getting my binoculars," said my father-in-law, and he turned to run to the house. The unbearable sound stopped, and the creature slowly stood upright to look at us. It was a long, skinny, all-black creature that could have been 8 to 9 feet tall. The body of a man is disproportionately skinny and long. His arms were so long that they would have passed his knees. He had no facial features. No nose, no eyes, just darkness. We collectively stood in silence, staring at each other and at the thing. About 15 seconds had passed, and it began to quickly float up the mountain. I'm not talking float, as in, was so fast you couldn't see its legs. I'm literally floating up the mountain. My husband describes it as being about 20 miles per hour in speed. It wasn't long before he had completely dissipated into the tip of the mountain. I will never forget that day. And I have not seen one since. I hope to never see one again. About 5 years ago, when I was 17, I visited some of my family who lived in SD and worked there for the summer. After about a month, my brother, sister, and her husband decided to do what Americans do best and go shoot guns in the woods. I had to work an evening shift, so it was decided we'd go after around 10 p.m. Once my shift ended, we went to their house to pack up the truck with some snacks, guns, and ammo. The drive took around 45 minutes, and it took us up a dirt road surrounded by trees and tall grass. Eventually, it opened up into a clearing that was pretty open and flat. The nearest tree line was about 100 feet away. It was pretty dark, but the clearing was lit up by the truck's headlights. I kind of felt uneasy, but I chalked it up to just being in the woods at night. For the first 20 minutes, nothing really happened. We were just setting up plastic bottles and those plastic gallon buckets you'd get water out of at an office. There was a feeling of being watched that we all felt. The area suddenly reeked of spoiled eggs. We looked around to see if we could see the source, and what I saw I can still vividly remember to this day. What I saw was a thin humanoid figure crouching down and looking at us. Even while crouching down, it was still about 6 feet in height. When I say this figure was thin, I mean skin and bones, which do it justice. The even weirder thing about this was that we all saw the figure in different spots in the tree line, but we all described the same features. Tall, thin, and had long, dark hair. We quickly packed up what we could and left. The feeling of dread I felt that day will forever haunt me. Since then, my brother has mentioned the area might have been in native territory, but I don't know if that's true. Every once in a while, I think back on that day and look up different stories and encounters people have in the woods, but nothing quite resembles what I saw that day. I moved to Minnesota about 6 months ago. It's a pretty cold state. More or less, I love it here. It's very peaceful, and when it's snowing, it's really beautiful. However, my image of Minnesota was changed last night. Me, my mom, and my stepfather were all sitting down and watching a movie in the living room. As the movie was about to end, we paused it because my mom wanted to go smoke and I had to use the restroom. Once I'm back from using the restroom, I go and sit down with my stepdad. A few seconds later, my mom opens the patio door and yells for us to get out there. We rush outside, and she tells us that she started hearing the noise of something big walking in the snow. When she started to look around for where the noise was coming from, about 40 feet away was a white trailer. She said that when she looked over there, she saw something with red eyes staring at her. She said that it looked like a really big dog. At first, my stepdad said that it was probably a coyote. Then I started to think about how my mom heard a coyote walking in the snow 40 or 50 feet away. I realized that it had to be something very big. I've always been one to believe in paranormal things. My mother, not so much. We look around for a bit longer, then we go back inside. A few hours later, I leave my room to go grab a soda so I can continue playing Halo. After the whole event, I've had this unshakable feeling. So I decided to just look outside to reassure myself that she was seeing things. As my eyes scan the edge of the woods, I don't really see anything. I take a deep breath, grab the soda, and close the fridge. As I close the door, I glimpse out the window and freeze. Sure enough, I see a pair of red eyes peering at me through the trees. I couldn't see much because of how dark it was. It was around 3 a.m. but I know what I saw. I saw something that I'd never seen before. Those red eyes went right through me. Then, as quickly as I had seen them, they disappeared. What did I see? I live in Northeast Ohio, and I got a new job about 2 months ago as a process technician at a dairy plant. It pays very good money, considering it's a 34 to 35 mile drive one way. After about 20 or 25 miles, I drive through a wooded area. Nothing uncommon for me, as where I live in Northeast Ohio, forests are common, and I pretty much lived in the one behind my grandma's house growing up. I work from 4 p.m. to 4 a.m., and the drive home is dreadful. Whether it's being tired, hungry, or the fog almost every night, I go the same way every day and night. I was driving my way home. I just left the residential area of my workplace and was going through the forested area. As I said, there's almost fog every night, so I'm on high alert for deer, raccoons, and such critters. It's just like every other drive home so far. I have a podcast on, am focusing on the road, am thinking of getting either a sausage McMuffin or McGriddle from McDonald's, and sometimes look off to the side of the road for any eyes reflecting off my headlights. All of a sudden, I see some smiling eyes. Out of the woods comes a coyote. In my hometown, coyotes aren't too rare. I've seen them in high school but had never seen one outside of my hometown, so it surprised me. I start slowing down as it crosses the road, until it turns to my car and sits on the road. It sat about 10 feet from my car. There had been no cars I had seen since leaving the residential area, so I was going to go around it, but I thought this was too odd of a thing to happen to just drive away from it. I expected it to just get up and walk away at any given second. This is where I began to get very scared. I honked my horn, and after about 2 or 3 seconds, it smiled at me. I have my brights on, so I can see it perfectly. This coyote had human-shaped teeth. My heart dropped, and every hair on my body rose, just as I was recalling this incident. It lasted about a second before sitting up and running into the woods. I sat there in fear for about 5 seconds before shoving my foot on the pedal and driving at getaway speed. I didn't stop and get food because I had, and still have, no appetite. I thought the rest of the ride home was what I saw. Once doubting, I saw it, but like I said, with my brights on and it as close to my car as it was, I saw it as clear as day. This coyote had human teeth, and there was no doubt about it. I'm very into the paranormal, and that includes cryptids. Is it possible I ran into a skinwalker or some genetically mutated coyote? I am Native American, if that counts for anything. So 3 nights ago, I decided to just go for a late night walk. I put on my headband flashlight and decided to take a path I hadn't taken in ages. There's a small trail near the back of my neighborhood that goes about 4 miles deep into the woods. My plan was to walk about 1.5 miles in and take the parallel path to come back. I make it down to around 1.3 miles, according to my Fitbit, and I start getting that feeling I'm being watched. I turn off my headlight and sit still to listen. At this point, I'm more concerned that there's a guy following me who is up to no good. I heard clear footsteps in the leaves off the trail, and they've been behind me for nearly 5 minutes. I stopped thinking it was an animal or another walker and became worried. I sit there for probably 3 to 4 minutes, and I hear nothing at all. I turn back on my headlight and decide to start walking quickly back home. About 2 minutes later, I hear footsteps again. This time, it sounds different. It sounds like 4 feet instead of 2 feet walking. And it's walking at the same increased speed I am. I turn around quickly with my headlight and my phone light and point them behind me. Silence. I get angry and yell, "Leave me alone. I'm going to call the cops, and if you come at me, I have a knife." Silence. I yell again to get the duck out of here and start walking towards where I heard the walking. About 20 yards out, hard to fully make out because the flashlight doesn't reach too far, I see what looks like a literal naked man running full speed on all 4s into the woods. Normally, I'd chalk that up to drugs, but my area does not have a drug problem. And there were some details that led me to believe it wasn't a person. For one, they were damn near hairless. He was completely bald, had pale white skin, and the way he ran on his 4s looked natural. Not like when you try to run on all 4s and look stupid. It looked like its bone structure was designed to walk on all 4s. There was no hunched look, their backs were flat, and they were fast. The last thing that happened was straight out of a horror movie. I hadn't heard anything in a while on my way back, but I kept turning around to be sure. With about 3 miles left to go until I was in the clear, I heard a mad dash through the leaves. I whip around, and it stops on a dime. I see the edges of its head behind a tree and yell loudly to try and intimidate it. What I heard next I'll never forget in my entire life. It cackled like a monkey. A noise I've literally only heard in nature documentaries. The tone was that of mockery, a predator having fun with me. I didn't stick around. I sprinted as fast as possible back home. I'd love to believe this was some prank or some rabid, bald, diseased coyote. But I got a pretty clear look at it. It wasn't. It had human feet and human hands. A human head and a human buttocks, but nothing else about it was human. I called the cops after and told them a man was following me. I didn't want to say something to some creature because they'd think I was crazy. They didn't find anything, but they did see quite a bit of activity in the leaves and dirt about 50 feet from where the trail was, leading far back into the woods before it got to a large stretch of grass, where no footprints were seen. This story takes place in 2014 in the northern part of rural South Carolina. I am absolutely sure where it happened. I drove this route many times during that year. Very dark, very rural, and this particular stretch of road doesn't have very many houses. This incident happened not far from an old church, so I have no idea if it is relevant. I used to work at a tattoo shop and live with the owner. Our route home took us through the area described above. We'd usually get home fairly late, this night wasn't any different. In fairness, I will say I had smoked some pot earlier, but I am a heavy smoker, and it doesn't affect me horribly. I don't think the passenger had done any drugs or drank anything at all that day. We're driving home, I'm probably driving about 60 to 70. I didn't like to go too fast because deer and wild hogs scared me quite often. We're talking about something, no idea what, and I'm slightly glancing over to the right during the conversation, as one does while driving. I notice something that seems to be running in the woods. Not unusual, I often saw shit at the sides. However, I realized that it was still there at second glance, which causes me to look and see what in the world seems to be still moving beside a speeding vehicle. As I turn my head to look, this form, which I can only describe as the very vague shape of a four-legged wolf-looking creature, but without any definition, runs ahead of the car, goes across the road, and into the woods. As it crossed the road and my high beams shone on it, it seemed to absorb the light. No visible fur, no reflection in the eyes, nothing discernible beyond a sort of wolf-shaped blur that was the literal darkest black I've ever seen. This all happened in the span of maybe 5 or 6 seconds, I'd guess. It startled me quite a bit, so I immediately said, "What the duck was that? What did you see?" I reply with a description, to which my friend goes very quiet and only says, "Tell his wife what I told him when we got home." I tell her, and her face drops, and she immediately looks shocked. Then they tell me my friend had seen it before with someone else, who denied seeing it. Same area. Same description. And he saw it too that night that I saw it, the same exact thing. I was on my walking trail behind my house, which is surrounded by fairly sized woods. Anyway, I was walking on my way and heard quick footsteps coming from the woods. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was just a bunny or squirrel, but they kept following me. Anyway, I was starting to get a tad paranoid, and that's when I was at an area where the trees and foliage were less dense and I saw it. In the trees a good distance from me was a large black wolf-like thing, but there was something very off about it. It was almost entirely black and a very dark, deep black at that, and then it began to make a very strange noise. I can only make a chipping, rapid-fire call without any pitchy sound or rasp. I've looked up a few things it could be, and my boyfriend thinks I might have seen a skinwalker, but I really doubt it. I looked up some animal noises, but nothing really matches it. There are areas here in Ireland where belief in fairies, elves, etc. is commonplace. A friend of mine was in Donegal at his grandparents' holiday home years ago. He went out for a walk with his grandmother, and when they were coming home, they saw their house on the other side of a large field with a few small hills in it. They walked in the direction of the house and climbed one of the hills. When they got to the top of it, they saw another but could still see the house. They walked up the next hill, and although they could see the house, there was yet another hill to climb. As they walked, they chatted, but both felt a little uneasy. They were walking and walking, but seemingly they were getting no closer to the house. My friend eventually said to his grandmother that he was scared, but they kept walking. In the distance, a farmer standing at a gate called to them and asked if they were having trouble. His grandmother shouted back that they were. He laughed and shouted, "It's fine. The wee folk are just playing with you. Take off your coats and put them on inside out." Feeling rather stupid, they did as he suggested. They walked over the next hill and arrived right at the house. He doesn't like to talk about it too much for fear of being ridiculed, but he swears that he was never more frightened than he was that day. On the last day of my camp retreat in Wisconsin, me and my friend were walking up to our cabin to go get our sweatshirts because it was chilly. My cabin is in the middle of 2 other cabins next to the woods. It is a public campsite, and people come and go as they please. The woods we are next to go on for miles and miles, and there are no known people living in them as far as anyone knows. So me and my friends proceed to the cabin while the rest of the campers and staff are walking back from night games. When we reach the top of the hill, we take our flashlights out to see where our cabin is. When I reach for the handle of our door, my friend says, "Hey, that looks like a guy," while pointing to the woods. I turn to see that there was indeed something that looked like a person. We chuckle, thinking it's part of a tree, but we start to notice that it's a humanoid figure watching us. Its height was abnormal, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. It had long, human-like arms, its body was grayish, and its neck was white. We look at each other, shocked, and start to back up slowly while still shining the flashlight on the creature. The creature slowly raised its arm and moved towards us, and that's when we booked it down the hill. Later that night, the staff patrolled to make sure nothing else happened around the campus. They come back to our cabin while I am calming down my friend and tell us that they saw some movement near our cabins, but he couldn't tell what it was. That night still haunts me to this day. Before the retreat, my brother's close friend even heard something trying to mimic the bullfrogs while he was in the porta potty, and when it showed up, all the birds and frogs went silent. The first day of our retreat, me and my brother also heard a loud dog-like growl. There is no one on this earth who can make a sound as real as what we heard, and there are no dogs to be seen anywhere. But I'm still wondering what this thing is. My brother thinks it's a flesh gate. So my family comes from Mexico, making me Chicana, and my father used to tell me about Mexican cryptids and legends growing up, which I was deathly terrified of because I was only about 7. Anyways, so he talked about duendes, or little elves or gnomes, and they're basically little mischievous people who are incredibly strong and mean and steal stuff, so if stuff around your house just suddenly went missing, it's because they took it. They may not sound so scary, but trust me, they are, and if you look up videos on YouTube, they're most likely fake, who knows, you can see they're pretty scary. On to the real story. My best friend used to live 2 houses away from my house growing up, and in the summer we used to play manhunt after dark, obviously, and the rules were we could stay on my property because I had a bigger yard, but when we would get chased, we could go anywhere, and I went towards her house so I could get away from whoever was it. On my way back, I pass one of my neighbor's bushes and see the silhouette of a little person running away into the bushes. I run back to my house and wait for someone to get out of the bushes, but no one ever does, and it wasn't an animal because they ran on 2 legs, not 4. I don't know what it was, but I was pretty young. I was like 10, and I was scared shitless. I had a rather odd encounter with some humanoid creature. It happened just a few nights ago when I was biking home from work. I work the closing shifts for my local Walgreens, so I get off work around 10:30. I live only 30 minutes by bike from my job, but most of the way home is on a heavily forested trail that doesn't have very many street lights, so it's always pitch black when I go home. Well, about 5 minutes-ish into the bike ride going home, I hit the beginning of where the street lights ended and darkness began, and like I always do, I pull out my phone and turn on the flashlight option so I can illuminate my way home. Well, only a few seconds after I turned it on, I tilted it up more and froze because I saw this tall, skinny, pale-looking figure for a brief second before it fell onto all fours and like the wind was gone into the woods. Shortly after, I started to pedal as fast as I could, because I had no clue what it was that I had seen when I heard a low screech and whatever it was keeping pace with me, hidden in the woods out of sight. I managed to get out of that area very quickly and didn't see or hear anything after I left that heavily wooded area. But a while later on, I caught a scent of what literally smelled like fresh blueberry pancakes or waffles, like as if someone were standing out in the field with a hot plate of just blueberry waffles or pancakes, which didn't make sense to me as there are no buildings in the area where that scent was, so I figured perhaps whatever it was I had seen was possibly using scents to try to draw people into the fields or woods. Now I do know a few areas around the trail are supposedly haunted, Teresa Dinner Theater that's not too far from it, a supposed haunted water tower in the area as well, and a couple other places. But no matter what I think of, I can't rationalize it or debunk it as something else. It couldn't be a deer because I have talked to people around the area and no one has ever seen a deer in the area, and besides, it was standing on 2 feet when I saw it, like it was a humanoid. There could not have been any other wildlife, because the only wildlife I have spotted is squirrels and birds. In 2001, my 6th grade teacher told our class this story about her childhood growing up in Texas. This would have been the early 1970s somewhere in Texas. She said there was a house down the street from hers that was abandoned. There were newspapers piling up in the yard, and the property was unkempt. For some reason, she decided to break into the house to explore. She broke in through the kitchen window in the back of the house, where she could go unnoticed, and landed in the kitchen sink. There were tons of empty bottles of mane and tail shampoo scattered about. She came across a creature that she described as part horse and part woman. Apparently she saw the creature from behind first, as she described seeing the back of a woman with long, lustrous hair. Once the creature turned around, she said it had a leathery face, huge teeth, and the body of a woman, but horse hooves. She ran back out of the house, frightened. Something strange happened a few weeks later. Apparently there was a man who lived at the house, or at least owned it. It seemed that he had been harboring the creature in this house. There ended up being a chase that occurred, with the man and creature trying to get away and law enforcement in pursuit. Myself and a few friends are staying in a cabin in Northwestern PA for the weekend, and the cabin we are at is on a gravel road but surrounded by 30 acres of untouched woods. Today, after eating an early dinner, around 4 or 5 p.m., we decided to explore the woods a bit. As we were leaving the driveway, I had an extremely uneasy feeling, and the forest sounds grew extremely quiet but then quickly got louder, so I ignored the feeling. As we stepped into the woods, we came across some very strange animal tracks. We are no strangers to animal tracks or the woods, so this was very out of the ordinary. Some of the tracks looked similar to those of a mountain lion but were sunken into the dirt as if they weighed in the 600-700ths of a pound range. Then there were some smaller tracks that looked closely to possibly a small dog, but there was just something off about them. They were too close together to be a normal dog. As we continue through the forest, we start to hear some strange but not too out of the ordinary sounds. As we pass a bend in the trail, we all heard a bigger branch or twig snap, and my friend spotted something that looked extremely similar to a mountain lion, but the coloration was off. As soon as he spotted it, it disappeared from his line of sight, so we immediately turned around and hurriedly walked back to our cabin. As we start to head back, I start to feel a very sinister energy and start to almost hyperventilate. My chest was very tight and I could barely breathe, which is very out of the ordinary for me. As we get into the cabin, I start to feel as if I'm specifically being targeted or hunted and couldn't take my eyes off of this one patch of forest. My friends were all feeling the same energy as me, but not as intense. We realized that the energy seemed to be circling us outside of the cabin, and when we looked outside of one of the bedroom windows, we saw a glimpse of the being far in the woods. During this whole encounter, I was struggling to breathe. It definitely didn't feel like a mountain lion energy-wise, and even the appearance of it seemed off. We didn't hear it make any noise other than the twigs/branches snapping. It was more of feeling the energy it was putting off. The whole experience didn't feel real, and I still can't make much sense of it. I can say for damn sure it wasn't like any living creature I've ever encountered. This experience I'm going to describe has taken a while for me to get together. It takes place in Yosemite National Park in August of 2017 with my two best friends, Zach and Andrew. Zach had worked that summer as a parking agent at Glacier Point and was pretty familiar with the area. The employee housing he was given was a house in Wawona with two other guys. Andrew and I were visiting for the week and had each been to Yosemite before. One of the nights there, we decided to watch the sun set over Chilnualna Falls. It was a great hike that Zach had done before. The trail was about 4 miles to the top, with about a 2,000-foot elevation gain. We brought food and decided to hike up, take a swim, and eat at the pools on top of the falls. We set out a couple hours before sunset. As we approached the top portion, we were about a half mile to the top of the falls when a guy about our age, early 20s, ran up to us from the bushes, frantically asking for help. His friend had fallen 50 feet off a cliff and had a shattered femur. Zach was used to this. After working in the park all summer, he had seen many injuries and was used to it. The man didn't have cell reception, but I did, so I called 911 and reported the accident, requesting search and rescue. After a few minutes, we decided we wanted to continue the hike after search and rescue assured us they would be there soon with a helicopter. We told the guy help was on its way, and we continued the next half mile up to the top of the falls. When we got up there, it was a picture-perfect scene. It was a beautiful sunset as we swam and ate. We then got an amazing show as we saw the helicopter land to pick up the injured guy we just encountered, right below us. I'm a private pilot and Air Force aviator, so I loved every second of watching the helicopter land on the mountainside. After the sunset, we began the hike down and past the spot with the injured guy, and search and rescue was taking care of him. We had a brief encounter with them, and they thanked us for calling it in. It was now dark out, and we continued the hike down. There wasn't much moonlight, it was pretty dark, so we used our phones as flashlights to see the trail. This is where the story gets interesting. The top of the hike was switchbacks, with a steep incline on the right and a steep decline on the left, with shrubs and trees. It was definitely too steep to hike down, hence the switchbacks. About 1 mile into the hike down, Zach was in front. With a light, I was second, also shining my light, and Andrew was in back. Zach was shining his light ahead and saw something sticking out from behind a tree that was about 15 feet ahead, just off to the right of the path, and instinctively shined the light at it. That's when whatever it was exposed itself from the tree and ran across the path, down to the left, and down the steep grade. It ran on 2 feet and resembled some sort of humanoid. It was a little shorter than us and very clearly had 2 arms and 2 legs, but it moved in an inhuman way. It kind of resembled a person. It had a head and its limbs but appeared to be just skin, with no clothes on at all. We all saw it and stopped dead in our tracks. We continued shining the light where it ran, down the left side of the mountain, but didn't see anything after it ran down. We were absolutely terrified, none of us really knowing what to say because we had no idea what we saw. The worst part was that we had another 3-mile hike down and 1.5 miles from the trailhead to Zach's house, all while knowing that this creature could be stalking us and was near. Luckily, we made it to his house, terrified and exhausted, but without harm. Whatever it was must have been just as scared of us as we were at it. I've done some research, and my best guess would be a skinwalker, but it didn't try to lure us into the forest with it. I believe I encountered a Bigfoot in northern Michigan, just west of Higgins Lake, in an oil field that has lots of trails that are nice to ride on with ATVs. This was last year. I had taken my 3-wheeler, an old ATV before quads, up there and was riding in the southernmost part of the field, which is a heavily wooded swamp. The trail was about 2 cars wide, and there was a partial clearing that went for about 20 feet on the right side of the trail. As I rounded the curve that led to the straight area that the clearing is on, I noticed something standing in the middle of the trail near a tree that happened to be right at the edge of the clearing on the edge of the trail. It was about 7.5 or 8 feet tall and brown, standing on 2 legs. It was about 100 to 150 feet from me, and as soon as I saw it, I braked, and it left the trail and went into the very dense woods at the edge of the trail. I was with another person riding, and they had seen it as well. We left quickly because while my machine could probably outrun it, the mini bike the person I was with was on probably wouldn't, only goes about 22 miles per hour. The ground was hard in the trail from vehicles, so there were no tracks, and the grass at the edge of the trail was very tall, and I didn't want to stick around too long to look for any out there, so I guess I have no proof, but it definitely was not a bear, as it wasn't structured right to be a bear, and it walked off on 2 legs as well. While it scared me,